She had never been chosen. Kira had always known she was different, even among her own kind. The Valari were not a species known for strength or dominance. They were gentle, glowing, emotional beings, often seen as fragile and ornamental in galactic culture. In a universe that worshipped power and spectacle, her people were ignored, and within her people, Kira was ignored even more. While others found partners, made bonds, and were praised for the way their light shimmered during union rituals, Kira stood quietly in the background, her glow dimmer, her voice softer, her presence forgettable. When she reached maturity, her family had encouraged her. "Just be patient," her sister had said once. "Someone will see the beauty you carry." Kira had believed it then, holding tightly to hope like it was a flame in her chest. She attended every seasonal gathering, wore the silks her mother gifted her, and spoke when spoken to. But as the years passed, the smiles from others faded. Some avoided eye contact. Some laughed. Others just looked past her, as though she didn't exist. Valari males were expected to choose partners based on resonance, the harmony of bioluminescent pulses. But none had ever felt that resonance with her. She stood in glowing halls surrounded by music and color, yet was always alone. The whispers grew crueler over time. "She's dim. Maybe she's broken. She's just not mate material." The words weren't said to her face. Valari avoided direct cruelty, but she heard them nonetheless. And they left deeper scars than blades ever could. One by one, her friends bonded and moved on. Celebrations became reminders of what she lacked. Her home became quieter. And each night, Kira would sit by the soft humming crystal in her room, staring out at the stars, wondering if perhaps there was something wrong in the core of her being. Something that couldn't be fixed. A defect in the soul, if such things existed. When she left her homeworld, it was not with hope, but with desperation. She applied to join interstellar cultural programs, anything that would take her beyond the stagnant silence of her life. She believed, or tried to believe, that somewhere in the wider galaxy, someone might understand her, someone might see her, truly. Her application to the Diplomatic Harmony Corps was accepted, mostly because they needed species with calming presences. She was sent as an emotional mediator to peaceful conventions. She traveled between embassies, seated always at the edge of the room, glowing softly while others spoke. Never included. Never acknowledged. At one such event, held aboard a neutral orbital station above the gas giant Belt Heron, she saw him. Tall, strong features, emerald glow tendrils. A Valari male of high caste. She felt a strange flutter, something rare. She dared to walk up and ask if he might join her for the closing ceremony. He looked at her, blinked twice, and then laughed. A sharp, cutting laugh that echoed across the reception hall. "With you?" he said, barely able to contain his amusement. "You should be honored I even heard you speak." She didn't reply. She turned away slowly, feeling every eye in the room on her. Every chuckle. Every look of pity. Every confirmation that she was less. Later that night, she stood alone on the observation deck of the station. It was cold, the artificial air brushing across her skin in a way that almost felt like punishment. She rested her hands against the rail and stared at the swirling storms of the gas giant below. So beautiful. So vast. And so utterly uncaring. She whispered to the stars, "Why was I made like this?" There was no answer. Just silence, endless and patient. She thought about home. She thought about how no one would miss her if she simply drifted away. She thought about how her mother had stopped sending messages, unsure of what to say anymore. About how her name hadn't appeared in any bonding registries for cycles. About how her glow had started to fade, barely visible now even in the darkest corners of her room. But still, she kept trying. Not because she believed, but because stopping felt like surrender. And surrender meant she agreed with them, with all of them. That she was nothing. In one system, she attended a relationship conference meant to bridge cultural understanding between emotionally expressive species. The organizers had encouraged her to give a speech, thinking it might show diversity. She had written for weeks, careful, thoughtful, hopeful even. When she stepped onto the platform and began to speak, her voice trembled but remained steady. She poured her heart out in front of delegates and dignitaries. When she finished, there was silence. And then, someone clapped. Slowly. Sarcastically. A loud voice from the back of the hall shouted, "Try acting next time, it might help." Laughter followed. Someone else projected a parody of her speech on the walls, mocking her inflections and gestures. She left before the end, her glow all but gone. Still, she traveled. Still, she hoped. In quieter moments, she would read human poetry, even though it was forbidden on some diplomatic channels due to its intensity. Something about it pulled at her. It was raw. Honest. Bleeding. Humans wrote about pain as though they had lived inside it and made it into a song. She clung to those verses, memorized them, recited them in her mind when the world became too heavy. She wasn't supposed to request a transfer to the experimental diplomacy convey near human-controlled space. It was a classified mission, not open to junior mediators. But she falsified her credentials and sent the request anyway. She was tired of silence. Tired of being overlooked. If humans wrote such beauty and sorrow, perhaps they would understand hers. Perhaps they wouldn't look through her. She didn't expect salvation. She didn't expect love. But something inside her, some flicker that refused to die, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she would be seen. The first time Kira encountered a human, she didn't speak. She observed from a distance, wary of interrupting their curious energy. They were unlike any species she had encountered before, emotionally chaotic yet grounded, passionate yet strangely collected when it counted. There was something deeply unfiltered about them, a rawness in the way they laughed loudly or argued without hesitation, showing vulnerability as if it were a strength. And they didn't glow. Not the way her people did. But somehow, they shone even brighter. Kira's assignment involved emotional translation and interspecies empathy mapping. It was a soft diplomatic post, polished for safety, more about reports than real impact. She filed her summaries, maintained her silence during briefings, and did everything by protocol. But every day, she found herself more curious. Humans interacted with one another through stories, gestures, jokes. They bonded over scars and triumphs, not through perfection or synchronized beauty. Kira wasn't sure how to categorize that in her diplomatic report, so she didn't. She just kept watching. The male she eventually spoke to was a junior mechanic, not a diplomat, not even someone trained for cultural interaction. He was repairing a power conduit near one of the unmonitored decks when she walked by. He didn't stare at her with curiosity or revulsion. He simply nodded, wiped his hands on his uniform, and said, "Hey." No formal address. No cultural hesitation. Just that. "Hey." It startled her more than it should have. She responded out of politeness, then almost walked away. But he said something else. "You okay?" 2 words. Simple. But no one had asked her that in cycles. Not really. She hesitated and then nodded falsely. He shrugged and said, "You look like someone who's used to hiding how they feel." She froze. It wasn't just that he noticed, others had noticed before, only to use her fragility as ammunition. But this human didn't weaponize his observation. He offered it like it was truth he trusted her to handle. There was no manipulation in his tone. Just a strange kind of acceptance. The next day, she returned to that deck. Not to speak, she told herself, just to observe again. But he greeted her casually, and eventually, she found herself responding. Their conversations were short at first. They didn't share culture or protocol. But gradually, the strangeness between them faded. He talked about Earth, the dry heat of deserts, the scent of ocean spray, the way humans celebrated failure as a step toward success. She listened, fascinated by a species that had survived so much chaos yet carried so much humor. When she finally confessed that she felt invisible to her own kind, that she had been rejected by every male she'd ever known, he didn't react with pity. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He just said, "Then they've got garbage taste." It was such a human way to speak, blunt, direct, a little bit ridiculous. But she laughed. For the first time in years, a real laugh. He smiled then, pleased that he'd managed to pull that reaction out of her. They continued to meet in secret, unofficially, undocumented. She knew the risks. She was violating numerous diplomatic boundaries, crossing professional lines, challenging ancient biases. But she didn't care. For once, she wasn't following a rulebook written by beings who never understood her. She was writing her own pages, one conversation at a time. He showed her music, Earth compositions that defied categorization. She shared Valari harmonic tapestries, those that had been buried under centuries of silence. They debated meaning, laughed at translations, cried over lyrics. There were moments she forgot what species she was. With him, she didn't feel defective or incomplete. She felt seen. Still, she was careful. The galaxy was not kind to mixed pairings. Most interspecies relationships were discouraged, especially those with political implications. Valari culture saw humans as emotionally excessive, unstable. Human records labeled Valari as too sensitive, passive. The assumptions were thick, layered, reinforced by history and fear. But they kept meeting. One evening, standard Earth time, she confessed that she had never felt resonance with anyone. That her light had faded to nearly nothing. That she believed she was born broken. He looked at her long and hard then and said, "Maybe you weren't supposed to match their rhythm. Maybe you were waiting for a different frequency." It was the most poetic thing she had ever heard. And he didn't even realize it. Their bond deepened in quiet ways. She learned his habits. He anticipated her silences. They spoke through glances, shared books, watched human films in secret. He once gave her a copy of an old human poem, translated for her understanding. "And still I rise? Not because I'm light, but because even shadows deserve to dance." She kept it with her always. But not everyone was blind to their connection. Whispers began. A diplomat mentioned her strange hours. A Valari counselor subtly warned her that attachment to other species could complicate emotional functions. Her glow, they said, was no longer pure. They considered revoking her posting. She lied to protect him. When she told him about the threat, he didn't flinch. He just took her hand, carefully, gently, and said, "If they're going to exile you, I'll be there. You won't go through this alone." No one had ever said that to her. Every time she had failed, been mocked, or overlooked, it had always been alone. But now she wasn't. She didn't know what it meant yet. They hadn't kissed, hadn't merged, hadn't spoken of the future uncertainties. But there was an understanding, fragile, unspoken, that they were no longer separate entities in a cold galaxy. They had found something rare. Not perfect, not recognized by any official decree. But real. And real was enough. In a galaxy that had rejected her from birth, she had found someone who did not just accept her broken glow, he celebrated it. The aftermath of their first kiss lingered in the air, charged with an unspoken promise. Kira had never felt so unburdened, yet at the same time, so vulnerable. The physicality of their connection was simple, a human touch, a shared breath. But emotionally, it was revolutionary. She had been taught to guard herself, to maintain her distance. Her people held tightly to tradition, especially where matters of the heart were concerned. Their rigid, unyielding social structures dictated that feelings were not to be shared casually, especially with another species. Relationships like hers were considered scandalous, an affront to cultural norms that had endured for millennia. Her mind tried to wrap itself around the possibilities, the consequences. She couldn't escape the deep-set knowledge that this bond she shared with a human, was something that would never be accepted by her own kind. Yet, there was an undeniable truth that pulsed beneath the surface. It felt right. It felt like a whisper from the core of her being, telling her that maybe the rules, the judgments, the boundaries, all of it was wrong. Maybe her purpose was to challenge those limits, to find something more than what was dictated by the elders. And maybe, just maybe, the universe had a different plan for her than the one written in the history books. The days after that kiss were filled with an unsettling mix of emotions. The guilt of disobedience weighed heavily on her, but so did the thrill of defiance. She didn't want to deny what she felt. She didn't want to pretend that their connection wasn't real. But the realities of their situation were inescapable. Her job as an interspecies mediator placed her in the heart of diplomatic discussions. What she was doing, what they were doing, could not remain a secret forever. The whispers would grow louder, the suspicions more pronounced. She knew there would come a time when her choices would be exposed, and the consequences would be severe. But the human was different. He didn't see her as an ambassador, or as a diplomat, or as a symbol of her people. To him, she was simply Kira, a woman, a soul, an equal. She was no longer just the product of her species' expectations. She was a person, with desires and flaws and dreams. And she realized she had never known that feeling before. As the days wore on, Kira became increasingly aware of the gulf between the world she had known and the one she was now beginning to embrace. Her people had always been quiet, reserved, dignified in their emotion. They valued logic, peace, and stability above all else. But what was she supposed to do with the chaos inside her? The storm of feelings that no training or protocol could quell. What was she supposed to do with the love she felt, a love that had no place in her universe? The human seemed to sense her turmoil. He spoke less now, knowing that the words between them were no longer needed to bridge the gap. Instead, they shared looks, gestures, and silence. They spoke the language of the heart, a language that had no need for translations. And as they spent more time together, Kira found herself learning new things about herself, about humanity. She had never considered that emotions, pure, raw, unfiltered, could be so liberating. The Valari had always sought balance, control, perfection. But perhaps perfection wasn't the ultimate goal. Perhaps imperfection, the messy, chaotic dance of emotions, was what truly made life worth living. Kira knew that their connection was dangerous. The threat was ever present. She had been warned by her superiors, advised by colleagues to abandon this relationship before it spiraled out of control. She had been told that such bonds would only bring destruction, both personal and professional. They were right. The consequences were dire. A union between species wasn't just frowned upon, it was forbidden. The penalty for such disobedience was exile, banishment from the stars she had known all her life. But the human didn't care about her status or her title. He didn't care about the politics that governed her every move. All he cared about was her. And for the first time, Kira realized that was enough. There was a part of her that wanted to throw caution to the wind, to ignore the repercussions and embrace the freedom that came with love. But she knew that freedom was a fleeting thing in their world. The moment she stepped away from the prescribed path, the universe would close in on her, isolating her, stripping her of everything she had worked for. The thought of losing her career, her home, her place among the stars was a weight too heavy to bear. Yet, as she lay in the quiet of her quarters, her thoughts often drifted to him. The way his hand had held hers, the tenderness in his voice when he spoke her name. She had never felt so seen, so understood. She had never been loved like this. The reality of their situation began to sink in. The stakes were higher now, the risk more dangerous. Kira felt the walls closing in. Her superiors were watching her closely. There had been subtle hints dropped, comments about her behavior, her interactions with the human. They didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but they knew enough. And they would not tolerate it. Not for long. Her world was beginning to fracture, the tension between the personal and the professional threatening to tear her apart. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss that seemed both terrifying and freeing. If she took the leap, there was no turning back. But if she stayed on the edge, never daring to fall, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. In the quiet moments, she wondered if it was possible to reconcile her love for him with the duty she had sworn to her people. Could she stand by his side, knowing the cost would be great? Could she walk away from everything she had known, everything she had been taught to believe, for the chance at something real? The truth was, she wasn't sure. but she had never felt more certain about anything in her life. As the weight of her decision began to bear down on her, Kira found herself retreating inward, struggling to reconcile her emotions with the relentless pressure of her position. The internal conflict had become an almost constant companion. She had always prided herself on her ability to think clearly, to make decisions based on logic and reasoning. But now, the lines between right and wrong, duty and desire, had blurred beyond recognition. Every choice she made seemed to carry with it the potential for irreversible consequences, and the fear of failure, of falling short of expectations, haunted her at every turn. Kira had always been taught that her people were the pinnacle of civilization, that their advanced technologies, their political acumen, and their cultural superiority set them apart from all other species. She had been groomed for leadership, trained to uphold the values of the Valari, the responsibility to maintain order in a chaotic universe. Her role as an interspecies diplomat had placed her in a position of power, and with that power came a certain detachment. She had always viewed relationships, especially those that crossed species boundaries, as distractions, potentially dangerous to the delicate balance she had worked so hard to achieve. But all of that seemed meaningless now. All of it faded into the background when she was with him. Every moment she spent with the human reaffirmed something she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. He saw her not as a representative of her people, but as an individual. He cared for her without regard for her species, her role, or the consequences of their bond. His love for her was raw, unfiltered, and unconditional. It was a love she had never experienced before, a love that transcended the rigid structures of her society. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she had been seen for who she truly was, a person, not a title or a symbol. And yet, despite the undeniable pull between them, Kira could not escape the harsh reality that their love was doomed from the start. The societal pressure was immense, and the Valari were not a people known for their leniency when it came to breaking tradition. The risk of being ostracized, exiled, or even worse, was too great to ignore. Kira had always known the consequences of defying her people's laws, but now, with the human by her side, those consequences seemed unbearable. How could she choose between him and the world she had been raised to protect? In the quiet solitude of her quarters, Kira found herself replaying the moments they had shared in her mind. She remembered the way his eyes had softened when they spoke, the gentle touch of his hand, the way his presence made her feel whole in a way she had never known before. The connection between them was undeniable, an energy that flowed between them like a current, binding them in a way that seemed beyond the physical realm. But despite the depth of her feelings for him, she knew that she could not allow herself to fall too deeply. The reality of her situation had already begun to unfold, and she could feel the walls closing in. There were whispers among her peers, subtle glances exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. The rumors had begun to circulate, and the more they spread, the more difficult it became for Kira to maintain the professional facade she had so carefully constructed. The human's presence in her life was becoming a liability, a threat to everything she had worked for. But as much as she tried to reason with herself, to push him away, she couldn't. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving him behind, of walking away from the only person who had ever truly understood her. In her moments of doubt, Kira would turn to her training, reminding herself of the importance of her mission. She had a duty to her people, to the Valari, and to the fragile peace that had been achieved through decades of careful diplomacy. If she allowed herself to be swept away by the tides of her emotions, if she let herself be consumed by her love for the human, she risked undoing everything. The peace she had fought so hard to maintain could collapse in an instant, and the consequences would be far-reaching, affecting not only her own future but the future of countless others. It was a burden she could not bear. And yet, despite the weight of her duty, there was a part of her that couldn't let go. The human was a part of her now, as much as she hated to admit it. He had shown her a side of life that was raw and unfiltered, a life filled with passion, uncertainty, and above all, love. His love was a force she could not deny, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw something she had never experienced before, a sense of belonging, a sense of home. The pressure from her people continued to mount. Her superiors were growing increasingly suspicious, and Kira knew that it was only a matter of time before her relationship with the human would come to light. The consequences would be swift and severe. She would be stripped of her title, exiled from the Valari homeworld, and cast into the unknown. And yet, despite the fear that gripped her heart, Kira could not bring herself to end things with him. Every time she thought about it, the thought of walking away from him tore at her soul. The internal conflict became a battle she could no longer ignore. She had always been strong, always been in control of her emotions and decisions. But now, she was caught in a struggle between her duty to her people and the love that had consumed her heart. She had never felt so torn, so helpless. The fear of losing everything, the love she had found, the life she had built, the future she had planned, clashed violently with the love she felt for him. In the end, Kira knew she could not live without both. The human had become her anchor, the one person who made her feel as though she was more than just a diplomat or a representative of her people. He had shown her that there was more to life than duty, that there was room for passion, for vulnerability, for connection. And no matter how impossible it seemed, Kira knew that she had to find a way to hold on to both worlds, her people and her love. But as the walls around her tightened, and the pressure to choose grew stronger, Kira found herself at a crossroads. What would she choose? Would she abandon her people for love, or would she sacrifice the only real connection she had ever known for the sake of duty? The answer was yet to be written. Kira's resolve began to fracture as she grappled with the enormity of the decision before her. Every instinct told her that she had to choose the path of duty, that the consequences of defying her people would be too devastating. She had been raised to believe that her role as a diplomat was sacred, that her loyalty to the Valari was above all else. But the longer she was with the human, the more she began to question the truth of that belief. How could loyalty to a people who had never shown her true understanding or compassion outweigh the raw, undeniable connection she had with someone who saw her as more than just a political figure? The fear of the consequences weighed heavily on her mind. She had always prided herself on her ability to think logically, to take action based on reason rather than emotion. But in the presence of the human, the logic became clouded, distorted by the pull of something deeper, something more visceral than anything she had ever known. The love she felt for him was not just a fleeting desire, it was a force that consumed her, one that refused to be ignored. It was as though a piece of her soul had been awakened, a part of herself that she had never known existed, and now that it had been stirred, it could not be put back to sleep. Her inner conflict intensified as she recalled the conversations they had shared, the way he would listen to her with such intensity, as if every word she spoke mattered to him. The human didn't just see her as a means to an end, he saw her for who she truly was. In his eyes, she was not just the heir to a powerful race or a diplomat caught in a web of intergalactic politics. She was Kira, a woman capable of love and vulnerability, someone worthy of affection and care. That realization had shaken her to her core. How could she turn her back on that? How could she forsake the one person who had ever truly seen her? Despite her feelings, Kira knew that the stakes were higher than just her own happiness. The Valari were not a species that would tolerate defiance. They valued order above all else, and any challenge to their societal norms was seen as a threat to the delicate balance that had been maintained for centuries. The consequences of a relationship between her and the human were not just personal, they were political. Her people would see it as a betrayal, a sign of weakness that could jeopardize everything they had worked so hard to build. The intergalactic treaties she had spent years negotiating, the alliances she had helped secure, all of it could unravel in an instant if her relationship with the human was discovered. And yet, the more she considered her options, the more the notion of sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of duty seemed hollow. The Valari had never asked her for her true desires, never cared about her personal life. To them, she was a tool, a representative, a means to an end. They didn't care about her heart or her soul. The human, on the other hand, saw her as more than just a role. He loved her not because of her status or her position, but because of who she was, flawed, complicated, and human. It was a love that transcended borders, transcended species, and it was that love that made her question everything she had been taught. But the reality of her position could not be ignored. She was not just Kira, the woman in love with a human. She was Kira, the heir to the Valari legacy, the one responsible for upholding the honor and integrity of her people. If she chose the human, she would be choosing a life of exile, a life of rejection by her people and the universe she had known. Her status would be destroyed, and the shame would follow her for the rest of her life. The weight of that possibility pressed down on her chest like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. The truth was that Kira was caught in a trap of her own making. She had always believed that she could keep her emotions in check, that she could compartmentalize her personal life from her professional duties. But now, as the days passed and her feelings for the human deepened, she realized that she had been fooling herself. Love was not something that could be controlled or confined to neat, tidy boxes. It was messy, unpredictable, and powerful. It had the ability to shatter even the most carefully constructed walls. In the silence of her quarters, Kira found herself staring at the stars, contemplating her future. She had always believed that the stars represented the endless possibilities of the universe, that they symbolized the potential for greatness and achievement. But now, as she looked up at them, she saw them in a different light. They were no longer symbols of hope and ambition. Instead, they seemed cold and distant, like the people she had been raised to serve. The human had opened her eyes to the possibility of a different life, one where love and connection mattered more than duty and politics. But was it a life she could truly have? Could she truly abandon the Valari for the human, for a love that was not bound by laws or tradition? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door chiming, and she knew, deep down, that it was him. The human. The one person who had made her question everything. She could feel the heat rise in her chest, a mixture of longing and fear. She had to make a choice. The moment of truth had arrived. As she opened the door, their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the galaxy seemed to fade away. In that brief, silent exchange, Kira realized that no matter what decision she made, she would never be the same. The human had changed her, had made her see the world through different eyes. And in that moment, Kira understood that the love they shared, though it may be fleeting and fraught with danger, was worth fighting for. But the question remained, could she truly leave behind everything she had ever known for a future that was uncertain, a future built on love rather than duty? The answer was not clear. But one thing was certain, Kira had reached a point where she could no longer live in the shadows of her past, confined by the expectations of her people. She had to choose her own path, no matter where it might lead. And with that realization, Kira took a step forward, ready to face whatever the future held, no longer afraid to follow her heart.